Forchtenstein, the Castle of Fear. For centuries, these imposing walls stood at the bloody border separating East and West, silent witness to the struggle of Christianity and Islam. Within this mighty fortress, history unfolded amid arrogance, incest, and intrigue, as did legends of evil queens and grisly scenes of death. Listen to the echoes of Forchtenstein's past, next on Great Castles of Europe. From this sweeping vantage in the foothills of Austria's Rezallia range near Vienna, one can survey the fertile lands that extend into bordering Hungary and Slovakia, lands bloodily contested as far back as human memory serves. Legend says that Attila, with his frightful armies of wild Huns, passed this way. He looked out from this strategic point with thoughts of building a fortress, perhaps inspired by the ruin of a Roman watchtower that still forms the cornerstone of the Black Tower. The tower today is white, its naturally dark rock plastered over during the last century. Any proof of Attila's fortress has disappeared in the mists of time. The first castle of written history belonged to the mighty counts of Mattersdorf. In the 1300s, they ruled over these lands. The castle's now gone, ordered demolished by Albrecht, ruler of Austria, who sought to extend his power to this area. The exact location of this castle is disputed. A recent theory suggests it stood here, just across from present-day Forchtenstein. After signing a pledge of allegiance to the mighty Albrecht, the defeated counts were allowed to build again. Their new 14th century castle was bigger, stronger, and more impressive than its predecessor. They named it Forchtenstein, the Castle of Fear. At the castle's centerpiece stood a central tower 50 feet wide, with walls 23 feet thick. Any attacker would be foolish to attempt to conquer its inhabitants. If by chance the outer walls were breached, this would be the final setting for victory or death. But until that day, the tower would serve as a lookout and the birthplace of grim legends. The grisly reputation of the Black Tower was fed in part by the legend of Queen Rezallia, who ruled with an iron fist whenever her king was away at war. She dispatched her enemies by throwing them into the tower's pit of oblivion to die. When King Lettus, aware of his wife's behavior, returned to Forchtenstein, he told her a story of a mighty and bad queen he had met during the war. He asked, "What would you do to a queen like that?" Rezallia, thinking she could escape his rage, replied, "I would sentence her to die in the pit of oblivion." And the king responded, "You have just spoken your own sentence." The queen was brought to the Black Tower, let down in the pit to dangle over the corpses of her victims, and starve to death herself. The guards loved to tease Rezallia and would approach the pit and call out her name. Her anguished replies to their taunts grew fainter. After 7 days, the cries stopped, and when the guards called her name, they heard only their echo. But according to legend, her ghost was spotted circling the Black Tower, a tormented spirit that could not find peace. King Lettus then built a chapel on top of the hill overlooking Forchtenstein, where Rezallia's soul came to rest. Then, the legend goes, Rezallia became a saint, someone to pray to in times of plague, and so the mountains that surround the castle were named to honor her. It's a good legend, though not a speck of it is true. Instead, a story conjured up in the 1800s by the castle's owner at the time. These mountains were named for a real Saint Rezallia who lived in Italy in the 12th century and was credited with miracles during times of plague here and in other parts of Europe. But the pit of oblivion is real. It still lies at the bottom of the Black Tower. Centuries ago, criminals saw their last days here, inside a 40-foot deep chamber of death. Sent into this oblivion, they surely went mad. But whatever stories they had died with them, their names and faces quickly forgotten. Even the extensive records of Forchtenstein don't mention these dead. Only the funds used to buy rope for lowering convicts into the pit were neatly recorded. During the 17th century, Forchtenstein came into the hands of an ambitious nobleman, a gift, in fact, from the Habsburg Empire. Earlier that century, the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, always a threat to the Habsburgs, began a march on Vienna. They were joined by rebellious Hungarian aristocrats who saw a chance to break away from the Habsburgs and create an independent kingdom of Hungary. But one nobleman refused to join the Turks, choosing to stay loyal to the Austrian emperor. The Turks took his castle as a result. When the march on Vienna was brought to a standstill, the nobleman was handsomely rewarded for his loyalty. Austria's Emperor Ferdinand II granted the nobleman the wealthy town of Eisenstadt and the great castle of Forchtenstein. The contract was signed on January 24, 1622, and bears the signature of Nicholas Esterhazy, the first of a long line of Esterhazys to own the castle to the present day. Nicholas Esterhazy, who started out as a peasant nobleman, fed his ambitions through convenient marriages with rich widows. His marriages yielded enormous tracts of land in Hungary and Austria. His first wife, Ursula Dörfsy, possessed large counties with hereditary rights, and this brought Esterhazy the rank of magnate. His second wife, Christina Nyari, also held great lands and many commodities. The Esterhazys were soon viewed as the first family of Hungary. Nicholas Esterhazy found his 14th century castle a bit out of date with 16th century style and began an extensive modernization campaign. In 1635, the castle was largely demolished under the supervision of Italian architect Ritacco. Only the infamous Black Tower remained untouched. Throughout the rest of the castle, windows were added, walls strengthened, and firearms increased. Nicholas Esterhazy and his children joined the builders, forming a chain to transport rocks to the building site. The rebuilding took some 80 years. The Great Well of Forchtenstein, a staggering 469 feet deep, was dug by Turkish prisoners. The well provided water when the castle was beleaguered, so it was of great strategic importance. Prisoners of war manned the treadwheel that brought up the buckets. An easier job, certainly, than the prisoners before them, who had to cut the well out of hard rock face. With the Esterhazys now members of the highest aristocratic rank, They needed to maintain regiments of 5,000 to 8,000 men. These armies stood at the ready, available to the emperor at all times, and when the alarm sounded, the soldiers marched from Forchtenstein under the orders of the imperial generals. Nicholas Esterhazy used his armies to fight the Great Turks, who constantly threatened the Catholic Empire of Austria. Victories scored on the battlefield were followed with bloody consequences. Plundering, raping, and a myriad assortment of tortures were popular. Armies used a scorched earth policy, razing everything found in their paths. The Esterhazy sons trained as soldiers and joined the army as soon as they were old enough. When Nicholas died in 1645, his 19-year-old son, Ladislaus, took command of the Esterhazy regiments. Battles brought prisoners of war to Forchtenstein. One prisoner, named Hussein, was so paralyzed by homesickness he could not do any work. Ladislaus, perhaps in a burst of compassion, set the man free. He would live to regret it. Years later, at a siege at the town of Rezallia, 1,000 Christian troops desperately fended off some 4,000 Turks. When the battle finished, nearly 2,000 Turks lay dead. The losses on the Christian side were small, but cut deep. 76 footmen were dead, along with them 4 noblemen, all of them Esterhazys, including Ladislaus. Ladislaus had been shot by a lowly Turk footman named Hussein. Hussein, realizing he had just killed his benefactor, wept in grief, then killed himself. Paul Esterhazy, Ladislaus' 17-year-old brother, was left in charge of the family's wealth. Paul was an interesting character in the Esterhazy dynasty, the subject of a rather peculiar family tree. His father, Nicholas, in trying to strengthen hereditary lines, wanted Paul to marry his own step-niece, a 12-year-old named Ursula. During this age of aristocracy, inbreeding was considered normal, and some noblemen, including Nicholas, deemed it necessary, a way to keep hard-won property in the family. The Catholic Church, however, forbade incest, and the Pope, after meeting with the Esterhazys, refused to sanction the marriage. Undaunted, the Esterhazys recruited one of the Pope's maids for help. No one's sure what happened next. Even legend doesn't offer an explanation, but whatever the maid did, it worked. The Pope granted dispensation quickly. Paul and Ursula had 18 children. After Ursula's death, Paul had 7 more with his second wife, Eva. But of his 25 children, only 8 survived, leaving Paul with a family tree not as firmly rooted as he would have liked. Paul's loyalty to the Austrian emperor was sorely tested in 1667. Paul was tempted into treason by his neighbor, the Count of Pottendorf, who lorded over a large dominion but wanted his own republic. Paul was invited to join this enterprise, lured by the promise of being named king of this new country. After signing the necessary treaty, Paul left the room, leaving his hat on the table to show his conspirators that he would return. In fact, Paul Esterhazy mounted his horse and rushed back to Forchtenstein. When the other men proudly looked at Esterhazy's signature, they realized they had been cheated. Paul had just signed something illegible, choosing in the end to remain loyal to his emperor. The plotters pursued Paul. Just before Forchtenstein, they nearly caught up with him. Paul clattered across the drawbridge to safety. Like every medieval castle, Forchtenstein acted as a fortress, much to the dismay of later generations of Esterhazys who did not take to its isolation in the mountains. After Paul Esterhazy died, the family used Forchtenstein only as an arsenal and vault for valuable family properties and papers. Normally, Forchtenstein housed some 200 people, caretakers who lived in the small houses in the lower part of the castle. The main building would lie empty, waiting for the next visit from the Esterhazy family and their often extensive entourage. One visit could bring as many as 45 guests and at least 16 horses. Still, the visits were sporadic. The castle didn't offer much except its hunting grounds. Its thick walls kept the interior cold and damp. There were no modern comforts, no sprawling gardens. The city held the lure of a more elegant and luxurious life. In its more than 600 years, Forchtenstein's walls have never been breached. The castle was designed and built so well that attackers never even considered trying to conquer it. Taking the castle would have required extraordinary tactical skill or remarkable patience. There were several approaches to take, though most of them fruitless. The castle rests on a solid rock overlooking most of the surrounding area. On the hills around it, only low brush was allowed to grow, providing a clear view of an advancing enemy. The castle would be most easily approached from the mountains. From this position, the invaders could throw firebombs inside the castle perimeters. Not that they could do much harm. The Black Tower was the central defensive structure, with walls 23 feet thick and a diameter stretching 50 feet across. The tower could easily deflect enemy boulders launched from the mountains. If the invaders were feeling confident, or perhaps foolish, they might dispatch small forces to approach the castle. Some might enter the moat, perhaps to plant a fire mine beneath the castle. A good idea, except that their every move could be seen from the castle platform. Certainly they could never get inside the castle's front door. A drawbridge would abruptly put an end to any enemy advancement. Other infantrymen might have tried less obvious approaches, such as attempting to scale the outer walls. Not a cautious move, for in those days there were no trees surrounding the castle, and the steep rock and exposure would turn any invasion into a mission of suicide. The only practical choice would be to sit and wait and let time flush the castle dwellers out. Time could mean months, though, or even years, for the defenders had huge stockpiles of food, and the castle didn't need many protectors. It could hold its own, a low-maintenance fortress. Forchtenstein's architecture reflects the practical defensive design of its day. It was never intended to be a pleasure palace, but a castle in the true medieval sense, a stronghold. As the spoils of war flooded in from battles between the Habsburg dynasty, Napoleon, and the Prussians, Forchtenstein grew into the largest arsenal in Europe. When the Habsburg dynasty ended in 1918, the Esterhazys stayed in place, maintaining a small private army to protect the castle and its lands until Hitler invaded Austria in 1938. By then, the castle had long lost its military significance. Although Forchtenstein was still an arsenal, modern firearms had rendered the castle obsolete. To the modern-day attacker equipped with tanks and rockets, the Castle of Fear no longer lived up to its mighty name. Today, the castle is still owned by the Esterházy family, though the last direct descendant died in 1989. A foundation now controls the extensive possessions and has opened the castle to the public. The castle we can enjoy today looks much as it did in the 1600s. The only significant change, electricity and water, installed in the main building in 1992. Though anyone today can explore the pits and passages of this considerable castle, there's one place that remains off limits: the treasure room. According to the Esterházy family, most of their treasures were transferred to the National Museum in Budapest when the communists took over. Still, the Countess of Esterházy will not allow entrance to the room under any conditions. So at least one secret of Forchtenstein remains untold.